Alrighty, so I do want to get to all of the issues in domestic politics. A shocking new poll that shows Republicans now up in the generic ballot, like actually up in the generic ballot, that's making a lot of headlines. Elizabeth Warren obviously making headlines. But I want to start today with a story that people are overlooking, and that is we may have like a full-scale war in the Middle East, another one in the very near future. See, when we decided that we were going to get rid of ISIS, that was a very good thing, but there's been nothing to fill the gap. And so what you're ending up with now is essentially 6 separate countries who are now involving themselves in a Syrian war. So you've got Iran that's involved in Syria. You've got Israel that's in response involved in Syria. You've got the Syrian government involved in Syria. You've got Russia involved in Syria. You've got Turkey involved in Syria. So it's a lot of countries involved in a very small space, all of them fighting for a certain level of supremacy. Of course, the United States is involved there as well. And all of this internecine warfare, it could have serious external effects. So if you missed it, over the last week, there was a major issue in which an Israeli plane was shot down. We talked about this. An Israeli plane was shot down after Israel shot down a drone from Syria. It was an Iranian-made drone, and Israel shot that down. Israel flew an F-16 over Syrian airspace. That was shot down by a Syrian anti-aircraft missile. And then Israel said, hey, you're going to shoot down our planes? Here's what we're going to do to you. And they legitimately proceeded to destroy half of the Syrian Air Force while it was on the ground. Because don't screw with the Israeli military, I think is the main message there. They went in an air raid, and they destroyed half the Syrian Air Force on the ground. One of the things this makes clear, by the way, is just how much of a lie it was. When Barack Obama said there was nothing we could do in Syria to stop, for example, the gassing of citizens of that country, Israel, in legitimately an hour, destroyed half the Syrian Air Force, half of it. Okay, if the United States had wanted to, under President Obama, after the original Bashar Assad chemical attack, we could have grounded his entire Air Force nearly immediately. But that's not the extent of the conflict. At that point, the Syrians basically backed off of Israel and said, okay, we're not interested in doing this right now. But that's really a proxy war, Syria, between Israel and Iran, because Iran is funneling supplies to Hezbollah, a terrorist group in Lebanon, through Syria, and they are moving all of those supplies directly through areas that Israel has been hitting. Meanwhile, there's the Syrian proxy war heating up between the United States and Russia. So on Tuesday, Bloomberg News reported that U.S. and Kurdish forces in Syria had killed 200 fighters, including a bunch of Russians. So Russia has a bunch of contract mercenary soldiers on the ground over there. And the Russians were fighting on the side of the embattled leader, Bashar al-Assad. They attacked a military base in the Deir ez-Zor region of Syria on February 7th. Now, there is no congressional authorization for American forces to be in Syria. Okay, this is why we actually need, as Rand Paul says, we need congressional authorization. If we're going to be there, then we ought to have Congress authorize it. The American people ought to be clear about what exactly our goals are there. Is it to solidify? Is it to preserve the status quo? Why exactly we're there? Why are men and women in harm's way? Why are we spending our cash there? The Russians, however, actually attacked a U.S.-run base, essentially. There's a U.S. force stationed with Syrian Democratic Force troops on a base, and those troops responded with artillery fire and airstrikes, and 200 to 300 Russians were apparently killed in that assault. Many of them were taken back to Moscow and treated. Now, the Russians are denying that Russian forces were involved in the attack, which at least is, for the moment, is a good thing, right? That's a good thing, because if the Russians were interested in some sort of open conflict in Syria, they would be claiming that America had attacked Russian soldiers, but they want to pretend they're not there in the first place, so this remains sort of a covert fight. However, Major Adrian Rankin Galloway is a spokesperson for the U.S. Department of Defense. He said officials believed roughly 100 people were killed in the raid, though he said he couldn't speculate about their nationality. Bloomberg reported the number dead was closer to 200. The New York Times said dozens of Russians were believed to be killed. CIA Director Mike Pompeo, this is according to Vox.com, also refused to confirm specifics when asked whether the U.S. was responsible for killing Russian contract soldiers in Syria during a hearing on Tuesday. He said, we have seen in multiple instances foreign forces using mercenaries in battles that will begin to approach the United States. So, again, in the last week, we've seen Israel take out half of the Syrian Air Force, and we've seen the United States kill something like 100 Russian fighters, apparently. So all of this is heating up in rather rapid fashion. And meanwhile, on the domestic political scene in Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu may be in some trouble. The prime minister of Israel has now been indicted on a couple of counts of bribery. One of those counts essentially suggests that he was accepting gifts from wealthy benefactors in return for advancing their interests. There's another case that suggests that he was trying to strike a deal that would have given him positive coverage in Yediot Aharonot, which is one of the major newspapers in Israel, in exchange for hurting Israel Hayom, which is the free rival to Yediot Aharonot. That one I find a little more suspicious, since the fact is that Israel Hayom is very pro-Netanyahu in the first place, and it is funded by Sheldon Adelson, who's an ally of Bibi's politically. According to the police, in Case 1000, Netanyahu received champagne, cigars, jewelry, and clothing by demand and systematically valued at about 1 million shekels, which is about 280 grand in American dollars. The gifts he received from the Israeli-American Hollywood producer Arnon Milchan increased significantly once Netanyahu was elected prime minister. So there is a case to be made against him in the media case. One of the problems in that case is that one of the people testifying against him is a political rival who is a former news guy, Yair Lapid. He is now in the opposition. He was Netanyahu's finance minister in the past, and he has been testifying against Netanyahu. Bottom line is that in order for Netanyahu to step down, he's probably going to have to be convicted. Unclear whether he actually would be convicted in these cases. And right now, with Israel under fire, it's pretty unlikely that Netanyahu is going to step down in the middle of all this. So what we're seeing right now, in other words, is chaos across the region. And the Saudis, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, the Israelis are all working hand in hand in order to try and stop the impact of Iranian influence in the region. Meanwhile, Turkey is trying to flex its muscles in places like Syria as well as Kurdistan. It is shocking how the West has abdicated its responsibility. And part of that, a huge percentage of that, most of that is on the Obama administration, which went out of its way to embolden Iran, which went out of its way not to do anything with Bashar Assad, which went out of its way to let ISIS run roughshod throughout the Middle East, at least until its latter days. The Trump administration has said a lot of the right things on the Middle East, but they're not actually doing a lot on the Middle East. So whenever there's an uprising in Iran, for example, we say a lot of stuff, but it's not clear that we're actually doing much of anything. In Syria right now, we're doing a few things, but not enough that we're actually seriously involved, and too much to say that we're not involved at all. At a certain point, we're going to have to take a harder position on what exactly we want to see happen in Syria, because otherwise the chances of escalation here are increasingly likely. It's increasingly likely that this will end up spiraling out of control. Israel will hit the Syrians will hit Israel, Iran will be drawn in, Israel will go to war with Iran. A regional war like that would look a lot like World War III, because Russia then might be drawn in on one side with the United States on the other. All of that would be due to the abomination of foreign policy that was the Obama administration. But if the United States doesn't take some pretty clear, active measures right now, then this thing could escalate out of control pretty quickly, and we would be dragged into a situation that we really do not want to be involved in the first place.
We will make America great again.